All right, so we are going to look at the bones that make up the cranial portion of the skull. The cranial portion is simply the cranial cavity. Any bones that have anything to do with the cranial cavity are going to be considered cranial bones. The other ones are called facial bones. So we start with the cranial bones. The very first one is pretty easy to see. If I move this kind of sideways here, you'll see this is a suture called the coronal suture. The bone here, which would be kind of considered the forehead, is the frontal bone. If I move, you'll see, and there's only one frontal bone. Now, I'm going to have this suture, right, which is the sagittal suture. It runs along the sagittal plane. Remember, sagittal plane divides right and left. On either side of this are called parietal bones. The parietal bones are pretty big bones. They come down. So I've got the frontal bone and two parietal bones. Then, if I look towards the back here, you'll see this little suture right here called the lambdoidal suture. You can remember that the Lamborghini has the engine in the back, and that's how I kind of remember the lambdoidal suture. Now, instead of looking at it like that, I'm going to turn around and I'm going to look at it upside down. So if I had this right side up and flip it over, you will see this bone here in the back ends up coming in it. The suture of it goes all the way through here. This is called the occipital bone or the occiput. Now, the occiput is the first of the cranial bones that's going to have a landmark that you need to know. And so the landmark, it has a couple of them actually. The first landmark is this really large hole here. This is called the foramen magnum. Sometimes people call it the magnum foramen. Either way, I have always called it the foramen magnum. Which foramen is the most common term used for a hole in a bone. Magnum means large, so this is a large hole in the bone. This is an interesting area. This is where the spinal cord, once the spinal cord enters into the cranial cavity, it is then called the brainstem, and this is the dividing line. Now, if you look on either side, there's going to be these little raised areas. These are called occipital condyles. Now, this is another part of a term that would be good to know. A condyle is a raised part of a bone that's usually a part of a joint. On the other side, there would be a fossa in general that the condyle would sit in. Those are two ends of a matched part of a joint. But for whatever you need to know here, understand this is the foramen magnum, and these on either side are the occipital condyles. Now, if I go back to look at this bone, this skull, I've got, again, frontal bone, parietal bone. This is one. The other one's on the other side. Occipital bone on the back. This bone right here is the temporal bone. All right, now, the temporal bone, again, now these four are all going to be associated with lobes of the brain. There's a lobe of the brain for each one of these, so it's really a good thing to know these. All right, so this is the temporal bone. Now, the temporal bone has a couple of things that you need to know. First, if I kind of lower it here, there's a little area here. We just talked about how there's a condyle and a fossa. All right, this bone, you're going to learn, the lower part of the jaw, the only movable bone in the skull, is called the mandible. And so where this little indentation is the mandibular fossa. And so I'm going to show you where it is on this bone. So this little part right here is the mandibular fossa. All right, you can see it on both sides here. Another thing that this has is going to be these little things that look like little vampire teeth here. You can see them, pretty sharp pointed spots that stick up. If I go back to this, you can see it right here. This is called the styloid process. Now, this is one of the first ones where I'm really going to make a point of, you need to be able to tell me what the structure is and what bone it is associated with. So this is the styloid process of the temporal bone. And again, that is super important because there's other styloid processes we're going to look at. All right. Now, if you look at this, and I pull it this way, you can kind of see them, here and here. These are the styloid processes of the temporal bone. And just a little bit lateral is a much larger, rounder bump. And again, if I go to this one, you can see it right here. This is the mastoid process of the temporal bone. And so if I'm looking at it from underneath, I've got, and it's hard to see if you're looking straight up because they kind of blend in, the temporal process and the mastoid process. If you feel behind your ear, so on this, again, the ear would be right about in this area. If you feel behind your ear, you'll feel this little bump. And again, it is called the mastoid process. Now, the next one, which was the first landmark that's on your sheet, is one that's kind of tough. All right. Now, I want you to be able to see this little part here. It says 30, I believe it is. On this, it looks like it almost says 30 or 3C. This is what's called a suture or a joint. This part that's coming off here is coming off of the temporal bone. Now, this arch, if I go up a little bit, you can see it here, or if I look on this model, you can see it here. This arch, the entire thing is called the zygomatic arch. So this part of the zygomatic arch, because it comes off of the temporal bone, is called the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Now, we said the most common name for a hole in the bone is called a foramen. In joints, most often you'll have a rounded area that's called a condyle and an indentation that's called a fossa. If we're looking at a projection coming off of a bone, it is generally called a process. We talked about these, this is the styloid process of the temporal bone, and this is the mastoid process of the temporal bone. Well, if I was able to take the temporal bone off and look at it on its own, this little part right here would be sticking out like a little teapot, short and stout. This is my handle, this is my spout. This little part would be sticking off of the temporal bone. And so it is called the zygomatic process, because it takes part in making up the zygomatic arch of the temporal bone, because it is coming off the temporal bone. Students seem to have a hard time with that. And I hope that makes sense, because we're going to look, there's 3 other parts to this that make up the zygomatic arch. All right, so this is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. And again, we have the mandibular fossa. Then we have, if I go down, you can see it a little better, the styloid process and the mastoid process. All of them need to be specified as of the temporal bone. Now, these 4, frontal bone, parietal bone, occipital bone back here, you can see it mainly here, and then the temporal bone are all very easily seen externally. Internally, there's a couple other ones that you can see. So this is the inside of the skull. So if I turn it around here, now I look at it this way, this is the inside of the skull. And hopefully you can see there's a little yellow line that comes through here and it goes down and around. In your book, these are colored, it shows up better. This entire thing is a bone called the sphenoid bone. Now, I will tell you that to me, whenever I look at this, hopefully you can see, I've got a really vivid imagination. So when I look at this, I see a Muppet. I see a little face right in this area. I see this is the mouth, and I got 2 eyes. It's like, "Rrr." So those are part of the sphenoid bone. Now, the sphenoid bone can be seen inside the ocular sockets, but we're not going to look at it in that area. So this is the way that it would be presented. This little indentation here, this is called the sella turcica, or called the Turkish saddle. I don't know if I can get a point where you can really see it really well. There's a little indentation here, and this is where the pituitary gland sits. Again, the sella turcica. The other part here, the 2 eyes, so the sella turcica would be the mouth of my little Muppet, and then these 2 little things here would be which would be on my Muppet, the little eye. This is the optic canal. So if I put the little doily there, you can see it goes through from the orbital socket into here. This is where the cranial nerve 2, the optic nerve, extends from the eye back into the brain, and it crosses at this point. So this is the sphenoid bone, this area here. And in the sphenoid bone, I have the sella turcica and the 2 optic canals. Now, the last one is called the ethmoid bone. And the ethmoid bone is a bone that is a really big bone, and you really only see it, or the best part to see it is in this floor of the cranial cavity. And this is it right here. This little area right here is it would be like an iceberg where it's just the top part. And that is the ethmoid bone. The part, there's two parts we're going to see here, and I'm going to point out one other part as well. But this is a really interesting thing. There's two little indentations here on either side. There's a ridge that's in the middle, and then indentations on either side. The ridge in the middle is called the crista galla, which actually refers to it looking like the top part of a rooster, the little crown on a rooster. And so this is a little ridge, this is a wall. And if you can understand that the ethmoid bone makes the upper part of the nasal cavity, there is a portion of the nasal cavity that I'm going to show you on this, of course, on this one. This little ridge here, this is called the nasal septum, this part in the middle. And the nasal septum is going to be made up of a couple bones, but this is going to be the top part of the nasal septum, and it's the crista galla. On either side of the crista galla are these little indentations here, and they're called the cribriform plate. This is where your olfactory nerve, your sense of smell, comes in, and it lays into these two little areas. And so they're basically the top part of your nasal cavity. So when you breathe in, the chemicals are going to rub against the little dendrites, the receptors that stick down through here on either side, and it tells you what you smell. So when you cross over that bridge going into Georgetown, it lets you know you're getting close to the paper mill. So that is the part this is two parts of the ethmoid bone. The crista galla in the middle and the cribriform plates on either side. I can tell you when I was in school, I had a professor that used to say, in order to smell what's on your plate, it has to go through the cribriform plate, to help me remember that these little indentations were called cribriform plates, because that's where the nerve goes. Now, if I turn it around and look this way, what we're going to say is this very topmost part here of the nasal septum, the topmost part here, is called the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. Now, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone is hard to see. The majority of the nasal septum is going to be of a bone called the volar bone, but we'll get to that when we look at facial bones. So it's really important to know on the cranial floor here, the cribriform plate on either side and the crista galla in the middle, that little area is the ethmoid bone. Again, if I draw back, this little area is the sphenoid bone, this is the sella turcica, and these two parts here on either side, boom and boom, are the optic canals. And that is an overview of the bones that make up the cranial bones as a portion of the skull.